The save-the-date cards arrived at my office by courier on a Tuesday morning, in a cream envelope so heavy it felt like an accusation before I'd even opened it. Gold foil script. A photograph of my husband, Julian Reyes, smiling beside a woman I had never met, his hand resting on the small of her back the way it used to rest on mine. Julian and Priscilla, together at last, June the 14th. I did not drop the card. I did not gasp, or call anyone, or press my hand to my chest, the way women do, in the moments the world seems to require of them. I set it down on my desk, beside a stack of shareholder disclosures I had been reviewing since 7 that morning, and I read it again, slowly, the way I read a contract when I suspect someone has buried a clause they hope I will not find. My name is Nadia Reyes. I am 38 years old, and until that Tuesday morning I believed I was still, in every legal sense that mattered, a married woman. I want to be precise about what I felt, because precision is the only thing that has ever protected me. I did not feel heartbreak first. Heartbreak came later, in the quiet of my own kitchen, at 11 at night, when there was no one left to perform composure for. What I felt first, sitting at my desk with that card in my hand, was the cold, clarifying arithmetic of a woman who has spent 11 years reading the fine print on everything except her own marriage. Julian and I had separated 4 months earlier. We had not divorced. I want that understood, because everything that follows depends on that single unglamorous fact. No petition had been filed. No judge had signed anything. In the eyes of the state, in the eyes of the company we had built together, and in the eyes of a particular clause buried on page 41 of a prenuptial agreement neither of us had looked at in a decade, Julian Reyes was still my husband. His family did not know that. Or perhaps, and this thought arrived later, sharper, uninvited, perhaps they knew it perfectly well, and had decided it did not matter, because women like me were not expected to check. To understand how a man's family plans his second wedding while his first wife is still filing his tax returns, you have to understand the Reyes family, the way I came to understand a hostile balance sheet, not by what they said, but by what never appeared on the books. I met Julian when I was 26, a junior counsel at a mid-sized investment firm, sharp-tongued and unglamorous in the way that made older partners underestimate me, and made Julian, 3 years my senior and already running his father's logistics company, lean across a conference table and ask if I'd like to review his shipping contracts over dinner. I said yes because the contracts were, genuinely, badly drafted, and because something in the way he asked, direct, slightly nervous, entirely unlike the polished men his mother usually paraded in front of him, made me think he might be someone I could actually trust. For the first 4 years, I believed I had been right. Then his father, Arturo Reyes, had a stroke, and the company that had been Julian's someday became Julian's now, and Julian became, slowly and then all at once, his mother's son, in a way I had never fully accounted for. Consuela Reyes did not raise her voice. That was the first thing you learned about her, and the thing that made her so much more dangerous than a woman who did. She corrected you the way a schoolteacher corrects a child who has, in her estimation, simply not yet learned better, with patience, with a small sigh, with a hand resting gently on your forearm, as she explained, again, how things were done in this family. Nadia, mija, she told me once, 3 years into my marriage, at a dinner where I had made the mistake of suggesting Julian's cousin was overbilling the company for consulting work no one could point to. A wife supports her husband's decisions. She does not audit them at the table. I smiled. I said nothing. I went home and pulled the consulting invoices myself and found what I expected to find, and said nothing about that either. Not because I was afraid, but because I had already begun, without fully admitting it to myself, keeping a ledger of my own. not of grievances, of facts, a lawyer's habit. You do not win a case by being angry in the room, you win it by knowing, months before anyone else does, exactly which document will matter. What none of them ever understood, not Julian, not Consuela, not Julian's sister Marisol, who had spent a decade treating me with the specific glazed courtesy people reserve for a piece of furniture they intend to replace, was that I had not married into the Reyes family as a wife in the ornamental sense they preferred. I had married in as general counsel, not officially, never officially, but when Julian's company restructured 6 years into our marriage, when new investors came in and the old family-run logistics outfit became Reyes Meridian Holdings, it was my name, alongside Julian's, on the shareholder agreement. It was my signature on the operating documents. And it was a clause I had insisted on, over Julian's mild objection and his mother's unconcealed irritation, that sat quietly on page 41 of our prenuptial agreement. The one document everyone in that family assumed was a formality, a piece of paper lawyers required, and no one ever actually read again. I had read it again. I read it every year, the way some people reread their own wills. Habit, discipline, the particular vigilance of a woman who had learned, long before Julian Reyes, that the people who loved you and the people who would one day need something from you were not always, reliably, the same people. The separation itself had been quiet. Julian moved into the guest house on his mother's property in April, telling himself, I think, that it was temporary, that we needed space, that his mother's health made it easier for him to be close by. I did not fight it. I had spent the last 2 years watching my husband dissolve, gently and without any single dramatic betrayal I could point to, back into the family he had spent our early marriage trying to individuate from. I told myself this was a season. I told myself marriages survived seasons. I did not know in April about Priscilla Aldrit. I learned about her the way I learned most things that mattered in that family. Sideways, through a source who did not fully understand what they were handing me. Marisol's assistant, a young woman named Dana, who had once worked briefly at my old firm, and still, for reasons I never fully understood, liked me, mentioned over a coffee I hadn't meant to turn into an interview that Mrs. Reyes, she meant Consuela, had been so much happier since Julian started seeing someone appropriate. Appropriate. I turned the word over for days. It was, I would come to understand, the exact word Consuela had used to describe Priscilla Aldrete at a dinner party 6 weeks before the save-the-date cards arrived. Appropriate, meaning the daughter of a family Consuela had known for 30 years, a woman who had never once suggested she might read a consulting invoice, a woman who understood, instinctively, in the way Consuela believed a wife should, that her role was ornamental. I did not confront Julian that week. I want to be honest about why, because the honest answer is less flattering than the composed one. Part of me, the part that had spent 11 years being the only adult in every room of that marriage, the part that had built the shareholder structure, negotiated the insurance, quietly absorbed 100 small corrections at 100 small dinners, part of me wanted to see how far they would let this go before anyone checked the paperwork. I wanted to know, with the same cold curiosity I brought to a hostile audit, exactly how much they believed they could get away with while I was still, on paper, in the room. So I said nothing, I filed nothing, I let the season continue. And then the card arrived, gold foil catching the fluorescent light of my office, Julian's hand on another woman's back, a wedding date set for the 14th of June, 5 months away, plenty of time, in the mind of a family that had never once imagined I might actually read the documents I'd insisted on, for a divorce that did not exist to somehow, quietly, retroactively, become real. I picked up my phone, not to call Julian, not yet. I called my firm's records department and asked them to pull the complete, executed copy of the prenuptial agreement, specifically page 41, the clause titled Anticipatory Conduct and Premature Reliance, which Julian's own family lawyer had drafted, at my insistence, 9 years earlier, and which not one of them, in all their careful planning of a June wedding, had thought to reread. I set the save the date card upright on my desk, propped against my monitor, where I would see Julian's smiling face every time I looked up for the next 5 months. Then I opened my email and began, calmly, without a single raised word, to build the case that would end their wedding before it ever began theirs. I did not send the email that night. I drafted it, the way I draft everything that matters, in silence, in the small hours, with the precision of a woman who has learned that the first version of any document is never the one you actually send. I wrote 3 paragraphs to my own attorney, Farah Okonkwo, outlining what I had found, and then I closed the laptop and drove to the house Julian and I had bought together 9 years earlier, the house I still lived in alone, and I did something I had not let myself do in months. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I cried, not loudly, not for long, but completely, the way you cry when you have finally stopped performing calm for an audience of exactly no one. Because here is what the card had actually done. It had not just told me Julian was marrying someone else. It had told me that an entire family, a family I had sat across from at hundreds of dinners, whose company I had helped restructure, whose matriarch I had called Consuela instead of Mrs. Reyes for 11 years out of a respect that was, I now understood, never once returned in kind, had spent months planning a future in which I simply did not exist. Not as an obstacle, not as a person who might object, as a rounding error, a woman who would, presumably, sign whatever was placed in front of her, quietly, the way I always had. I let myself feel that for one night. Then, the next morning, I went back to being the only person in that family who read the documents. The first call came from Consuela, not Julian, 3 days after the card arrived. She had, I would learn, a genius for never being the one who delivered bad news directly. She preferred to arrive after the damage was already assumed, offering comfort for a wound she herself had opened. Nadia, mija, she said, her voice warm in the specific way that had once made me feel welcomed and now simply made me watch for the blade beneath it. I wanted to call you myself, before you heard it from someone unkind. Julian and I have been so worried about how to tell you gently. Tell me what, Consuela, I said. I already knew. I wanted to hear how she would say it. About Priscilla, she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice at all, no shame, only the smooth patience of a woman explaining something obvious to a child. You have to understand, Nadia, you and Julian, you were separated. Everyone could see it wasn't working. A man cannot wait forever for a woman to decide what she wants. Priscilla understands what he needs. She isn't going to sit in an office until 9 at night reading contracts when her husband needs his dinner. I closed my eyes. 11 years, and she had never once let go of that particular resentment. The nights I'd spent, in the company's early years, restructuring debt covenants so her husband's company would survive a recession, framed forever afterward as a failure of wifely attention. We're not divorced, Consuela, I said, keeping my voice level. There's no petition filed, nothing has been finalized. There was a pause. Not a guilty one, an irritated one, the pause of a woman being asked to explain arithmetic she considered beneath her. Nadia, please, you know what I mean. You and Julian both know this marriage ended in April. The paperwork is a formality. I would think, of all people, you would understand that sometimes the spirit of a thing matters more than the letter of it. I almost laughed. Sitting in my kitchen, I almost laughed out loud because in 11 years of marriage, no sentence had ever more perfectly summarized everything wrong with how that family had used me. The spirit of a thing matters more than the letter of it, offered by the one woman in the world who had never once, in any dealing involving money, actually believed that. "I'll let Julian know I received the invitation," I said, and ended the call before she could soften it further. Julian called that evening. This, at least, he did himself, and I will give him this much credit, even now. He did not hide behind his mother when I finally forced the conversation into the open. "I didn't think you'd take it this hard," he said, and I heard, underneath the words, something that might have been genuine confusion. Not cruelty exactly, something worse, in its way. A man who had drifted so far back into his family's current that he had stopped noticing which parts of his life still belonged to someone else. "Julian," I said, "we are still married. You sent out cards for a second wedding while you are still legally married to me. It's not, Nadia, come on. Everyone knew we were done. You knew we were done. I knew we were separated. I never received divorce papers because you never filed any." "Did you file any, Julian?" Silence. A long one. I let it sit there, the way I let silences sit in negotiations, because the person who fills it first usually tells you the most. "I told my mother's lawyer to handle it," he finally said, and something in his voice had gone smaller. "I assumed it was done. I've been, Nadia, my father's been sick again. The company's been a mess since the Guyana contract fell through. I haven't had the bandwidth to end your own marriage before starting another one," I said quietly. "I understand. It slipped your mind. That's not fair." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." He didn't apologize. That was the part that stayed with me longest, longer than the card, longer than his mother's phone call. He explained. He contextualized. He offered me the shape of an apology. "I should have handled this differently. I know this isn't easy for you," without ever once landing on the words themselves, because somewhere in the last 4 months, in his mother's guest house, surrounded by a family that had never forgiven me for being a wife who read contracts instead of one who simply trusted, Julian had relearned the family's oldest lesson, that things done carelessly are not really wrongs, as long as no one important objects. I had been, for 11 years, the important person who objected. I had simply stopped being loud about it. The gaslighting, when it came, did not come as a single dramatic scene. It arrived the way water arrives in a house with a slow leak. Small, deniable, easy to doubt, until the day you finally pull up the floorboard and find the rot has been there for years. Marisol called 2 days later, ostensibly to check in, and spent 40 minutes explaining to me, gently, that I was misremembering the timeline of our separation, that Julian had told her months ago that our divorce was finalized, that perhaps I was confusing myself, that stress could do that to a person, that she only wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself during such a hard adjustment. I did not argue. I had learned, over 11 years, that arguing with a Reyes about a fact was like arguing with weather, pointless, and faintly demeaning to attempt. Instead, I asked her, mildly, whether she had seen the divorce decree herself, whether anyone in the family had actually seen a signed document with a judge's name on it. She didn't answer that question. She changed the subject to Priscilla's dress, which she described, unprompted, as so much more traditional than anything you would have chosen, honestly, softer, you know, not so severe. I wrote that down too, later, in the private file I had begun keeping, not for any court, not yet, but for myself, a record of exactly how a family builds a story sturdy enough to survive an inconvenient wife. Not so severe. As if 11 years of building a company's legal architecture from the ground up, of protecting Julian's family from 3 separate lawsuits, of sitting in a hospital corridor holding Consuela's hand the night Arturo had his stroke, could be summarized, retroactively, as a kind of harshness that a softer woman would never have inflicted on them. I began to understand, in those weeks, the precise mechanism of what they were doing. It was not that they believed the divorce was final. Somewhere, in the part of themselves that dealt with facts rather than convenience, I think every one of them, Consuela, Marisol, even Julian, knew perfectly well that no petition had been filed. What they were doing was something subtler, and in its way, more insulting. They were betting that I would not check, that I would absorb the humiliation the way I had absorbed 100 small humiliations before, quietly, for the sake of peace, because that was the role they had always assigned me, and I had always, until now, played it. They had forgotten, or perhaps had simply never fully believed, that the woman who insisted on page 41 of that prenuptial agreement, the woman who restructured their company's debt and read every consulting invoice and kept, without ever announcing it, her own private ledger of every account that didn't balance, was not a woman who forgot how to check. I went to see my attorney the following Monday, the printed prenuptial agreement, in a folder on my lap, page 41 flagged with a yellow tab I'd placed there 9 years earlier and never removed. "Farah," I said, sliding the folder across her desk, "I need you to tell me exactly how much trouble a man can get himself into by planning a wedding while he's still married to someone else. And I need you to tell me what happens to a company's shareholder structure when that trouble becomes public." Farah read the clause once, slowly, then she read it again, and looked up at me with the particular expression of a lawyer who has just realized a case is about to become far more interesting than the client originally led on. "Nadia," she said, "did you write this clause?" "I insisted on it," I said. 9 years ago. Everyone thought I was being paranoid. "You weren't paranoid," she said. "You were early." Farah spread the prenuptial agreement across her desk the way a surgeon lays out instruments before an operation, unhurried, precise, each page given exactly the attention it deserved and not a moment more. "Walk me through why this clause exists," she said, "in your own words, not the legal language. Why did you, personally, insist on this?" I thought about it for a moment before I answered, because the true answer was older than my marriage to Julian, older than the company, older than the Reyes family entirely. "My mother," I said, "spent 4 years believing she was still married to my father after he'd already started a second household 2 states away. He never filed, he just left, quietly, and let her keep believing the paperwork existed somewhere, doing its work in the background, protecting her. By the time she found out it didn't, he'd already spent 4 years transferring assets into his new partner's name. She got nothing, not because the law was against her, because she never checked, and by the time she did, there was nothing left to check." Farah nodded slowly. "So you built a clause that makes checking unnecessary. The obligation runs the other way." "Exactly." Page 41, titled Anticipatory Conduct and Premature Reliance, was not, on its surface, a dramatic piece of drafting. It was the kind of clause that exists in exactly the way insurance exists, invisible, unremarkable, until the specific and unlikely circumstance it was written for actually occurs. It stated, in language I had negotiated word by word with Julian's family attorney 9 years earlier, that if either party entered into a public representation of marital dissolution, a public announcement, formal or informal, of intent to remarry, of engagement, or of a second marriage, prior to the actual legal finalization of divorce from the other party, that act would be treated, for the purposes of the agreement, as a material breach of good faith, triggering an automatic reallocation of marital property and shareholder interests. At the time, Julian's family attorney had barely blinked at the clause. It had seemed, to everyone in that conference room 9 years ago, like exactly the kind of overcautious language a young wife's overcautious lawyer might insist on, and no one would ever actually need. A fire extinguisher bolted to a wall, no one expected to catch fire. The reallocation clause was specific and, Farah confirmed after an hour of careful reading, entirely enforceable. In the event of a triggering breach, the breaching party's shares in any jointly held business entity, in this case, Reyes Meridian Holdings, would transfer to the non-breaching spouse at a ratio of 70-30, effective immediately upon the triggering event, regardless of the outcome of the eventual divorce proceedings themselves. Julian owned 41% of Reyes Meridian Holdings. I owned 22%, a figure that had always quietly irritated Consuela, who considered it generous. Under the clause, if Julian's public wedding announcement to Priscilla Aldrate counted as a triggering breach, and a save-the-date card mailed to guests announcing a wedding date, describing the couple as together at last, was about as public a representation as existed short of a newspaper announcement, I would be entitled to 70% of his 41%. I did the arithmetic slowly, the way I had learned to do all-important arithmetic, twice, on paper, before I let myself believe it. Julian's 29% would become mine. Combined with my existing 22, I would hold 51% of Reyes Meridian Holdings. Controlling interest. I sat very still in Farah's office for a long moment, feeling something I had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not yet, but a kind of vertigo, the specific dizziness of watching a door you built 9 years ago, as a precaution swing open into a room you had never actually let yourself imagine standing in. This only works, Farah said carefully, watching my face, if you can prove the breach was public, unambiguous, and predates any divorce filing. If Julian's lawyers file a hasty petition this week and backdate paperwork. They can't backdate a court filing, I said, not without it being obvious. No. But they might try to argue the save-the-date card wasn't a formal representation, that it's a private family document, not a public announcement, and that the clause requires something more official. I thought about the card, sitting propped against my monitor at the office. Gold foil. A photograph. A date. Mailed, by courier, to what I now knew, because I had, in the intervening days, quietly, and without announcing it to anyone, begun compiling a guest list from 3 separate sources, was a mailing of over 200 invitations, including business associates, 2 members of the Reyes Meridian Board, and a food and wine writer for the regional lifestyle magazine, who had already, I discovered, with something between horror and grim satisfaction, posted a congratulatory note on social media, tagging both Julian and Priscilla by name. "It's public," I said. "It's about as public as it gets. Then we need to document it. Every piece, the mailing list, the vendor contracts if there are any, venue deposits, catering, a wedding website if they've built one. Anything that shows a court this wasn't a private family understanding, it was an active, funded, publicly announced second marriage while the first one remained legally intact." What followed were 5 of the strangest weeks of my life. Weeks in which I continued attending Reyes Meridian board meetings, as though nothing had changed, continued fielding Consuela's calls with the same measured, unbothered courtesy I had cultivated over a decade, continued even, sending Julian a polite reply to a logistics question about a shipping contract renewal, all while quietly, methodically, building a case file that would end everything they were building without their ever suspecting the ground beneath them had already shifted. I did not confront anyone further. This was, I understood, the most important discipline of the entire strategy. Not silence out of weakness, but silence as a tool. The same silence I had used 100 times negotiating a settlement. Never show your hand until the moment revealing it cost your opponent the most and cost you nothing. I hired a document review specialist, discreetly, through Farah's firm, who confirmed within a week what I had begun to suspect. The wedding was not a modest family gathering, hastily arranged in wounded pride. It was fully funded. A venue deposit of $11,000 had been paid at the Cordillera estate, a property the Reyes family had used for 2 prior company galas, meaning the deposit check I requested and received through a discovery request Farah filed under a separate, quieter pretext, had been drawn from a Reyes Meridian corporate account, not Julian's personal funds. The company's. I sat with that fact for a long time. Julian had used company money, money in which I held a 22% stake, money whose allocation required, under our own bylaws, sign-off from any shareholder holding more than 15%, to fund a wedding to another woman while still married to me. He had not asked me, he had not needed to, in his mind, because in his mind the marriage was already a formality no one still respected. He was about to learn otherwise. I also in those weeks did something I am not entirely proud of, though I have never regretted it. I let Consuela believe she was winning when she called to ask, with elaborate casualness, whether I intended to attend the June wedding as a show of maturity. For Julian's sake, I told her I would think about it. When she asked whether I'd be willing to sign a quiet, informal release acknowledging the marriage had effectively ended in April, a document, I now understood, designed to paper over the exact gap in the timeline that the clause on page 41 existed to punish, I told her I needed time to consider it, that this was, after all, still difficult for me. She believed me. That was the point. A woman still absorbing her humiliation quietly is not a woman anyone thinks to investigate. I met with Farah one final time, 4 weeks before the wedding date, the case file between us now 3 inches thick. The save-the-date mailing list, the venue deposit records, the corporate account statements, a sworn statement from the magazine writer confirming she had received the invitation as a public announcement rather than a private family notice, and, most damning of all, a text message Marisol had sent to a mutual acquaintance, forwarded to me by the same acquaintance out of what I can only assume was guilt, that read, "Mom wants everything locked in before Nadia can make trouble. She's slow to react, but once she moves she doesn't stop. Better to be married and done before she figures out the timeline matters." They had known, some part of them, at least, had always known the timeline mattered. They had simply gambled that I was, as they'd always assumed, too slow, too accommodating, too invested in peace to ever check. "When do you want to move?" Farah asked. I looked at the calendar on her wall. 4 weeks to the wedding, enough time for the invitations to be fully out, the venue fully booked, the guest list fully public, the corporate funds fully spent and fully documented, enough time for every element of the breach to be irreversible, unambiguous, and expensive to unwind. Not enough time for them to quietly file a real divorce petition and pretend, retroactively, that none of this had ever been improper. "Not yet," I said. "I want the wedding invitations to go final. I want the caterers paid. I want every dollar spent before I say a single word." Farah smiled, the way she did when a client finally stopped thinking like someone protecting herself and started thinking like someone who intended to win. "That's cold, Nadia." "No," I said, closing the folder gently, the way you close a door you intend to open again very soon, very deliberately, in front of an audience. "That's just good bookkeeping." The wedding was 11 days away when I finally moved, and I chose the venue for the reveal with the same deliberate precision I had chosen everything else. Not a courtroom, not a lawyer's conference room, but a Reyes Meridian Holdings board meeting, scheduled quarterly, on the calendar for over a year, attended by exactly the people who needed to witness what was about to happen, and not one person more. I want to be honest about something. I had imagined this moment more than once in the preceding weeks. Imagined it, I am somewhat ashamed to admit, with more heat than I usually allow myself. But when the morning actually came, sitting in my car outside the Reyes Meridian offices with the case file on the passenger seat, what I felt was not heat at all. It was the same flat, focused calm I remembered from closing arguments in my earliest years of practice, the calm of a person who has already done all the difficult work and now only has to say it out loud. The boardroom held 8 people that morning: Julian, at the head of the table where his father used to sit; Consuela, present as she always insisted on being, technically only an advisor but functionally the room's true authority; 2 outside board members, Mr. Halverson and Miss Okafor, both of whom had joined the company during the restructuring I myself had architected; the CFO, a careful man named Diego Ruiz, who had, I suspected, already begun quietly wondering about the Cordillera estate deposit; and Farah, seated beside me, her expression arranged into the particular neutral courtesy of an attorney who knows exactly what is about to happen and has decided to let the moment breathe before she speaks. Julian smiled when I walked in. An easy, careless smile, the smile of a man who believed the hardest conversation of the last 5 months was already behind him. "Nadia," he said. "Glad you could make it. We've got the Q2 logistics numbers first, then—" "Before we start on Q2, I said, taking my seat, "I'd like to raise an item under new business. It concerns a corporate expenditure that requires shareholder disclosure and a matter related to the marital status clause in Section 12 of the original Founders' Agreement." The room did not react immediately. That was the strange thing about the moment I had waited weeks for. It did not arrive as thunder. It arrived quietly, the way most real reckonings do, disguised at first as procedure. Diego Ruiz shifted slightly in his seat. He knew, I would learn later, exactly which expenditure I meant, because he had signed off on the wire transfer himself, uneasily, after Consuela told him it was a family matter, not a board matter, and he had, against his better judgment, believed her. "Nadia," Consuela said, her voice pleasant, faintly amused, the voice of a woman certain this was a misunderstanding she could resolve in under a minute. "I don't think personal matters need to be discussed in a board meeting." "I agree," I said. "Which is why I want to be clear, this isn't personal, it's financial." On March the 2nd, $11,000 was transferred from Reyes Meridian's corporate events account to the Cordillera estate as a deposit for an event scheduled for June the 14th. "Diego, can you confirm that transfer?" Diego's eyes flicked, involuntarily, to Consuela before he answered. That flick told the entire room everything the transfer record itself would confirm a moment later. There was a transfer," he said carefully. "I was told it was pre-approved." "By whom?" "Mrs. Reyes." A pause. "Consuela." "I see." I let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "Consuela, do you hold a 15% or greater share in Reyes Meridian Holdings?" "You know I don't, Nadia. I've always managed things informally. Arturo trusted." Then under Section 9 of the bylaws, which, for the board's reference, I've included on page 2 of the packet in front of you, any expenditure of corporate funds exceeding $5,000 for a non-operational purpose requires sign-off from a shareholder holding 15% or greater. I hold 22%. I was never consulted. Julian holds 41%. Julian, were you consulted on this expenditure, or did you simply allow it? Julian's easy smile had entirely disappeared. Nadia, you're making this into something it isn't. It was a family event. My mother handled the deposit. I didn't think. A family event, I repeated, funded with company money for a wedding between you and Priscilla Aldrett, scheduled for June the 14th. Is that correct? The room had gone very still. Mr. Halverson, I noticed, had quietly pulled the packet closer to himself and begun reading with the focused attention of a man who has just realized the meeting he thought would end by 11 is going to run considerably longer. Yes, Julian said, and to his credit, he did not try to lie about it in front of the board, though I could see, in the set of his jaw, how badly he wanted to. Yes, that's correct. And on what date? I asked, my voice never rising, never sharpening. Was our divorce finalized, Julian? The silence that followed was, I think, the longest silence I have ever sat inside of, in a career built on sitting inside silences. The petition was filed, he started. When? I said again, gently, the way you press on a bruise you already know is there. 2 weeks ago, he said finally, after the save the dates went out. I know that looks. I'm not asking how it looks, I said. I'm establishing the timeline for the board's record because it's relevant to a clause in our founders' agreement and prenuptial agreement, both of which are cross-referenced in Reyes Meridian's shareholder documentation. I turned to a fresh page. Page 41 of our prenuptial agreement contains a clause titled Anticipatory Conduct and Premature Reliance. It states that a public representation of remarriage or engagement, made prior to legal finalization of divorce, constitutes a material breach of good faith, triggering automatic reallocation of jointly held business interests at a ratio of 70-30 in favor of the non-breaching party. I slid a copy across the table. Farah slid a second copy to Mr. Halverson and Miss Okafor. A save-the-date announcement, mailed to over 200 recipients including 2 members of this board, describing you and Miss Aldrete as, quote, together at last, with a wedding date and public venue, constitutes exactly the kind of public representation the clause defines. Our divorce was not filed until after that mailing went out, which means, under the terms of an agreement this board's own legal counsel reviewed and approved 9 years ago, the breach occurred while we were still legally married. Nadia, this is insane. You can't. I can, I said, and for the first time I let a small, exact edge into my voice. Not anger, but certainty. And I have. Farah, would you walk the board through the share reallocation? Farah did in the calm, procedural tone she used for exactly these moments, explaining that under the clause's terms, 29 of Julian's 41% would transfer to me, effective as of the date of the triggering breach, the date of the save-the-date mailing, independently verifiable through postal records, vendor invoices, and a sworn statement already filed with the court overseeing the newly opened divorce proceedings. Combined with Nadia's existing 22%, Farah said, this results in a 51% controlling interest in Reyes Meridian Holdings, effective immediately, pending the routine confirmation hearing already scheduled for next Thursday. Consuela stood up. I had never, in 11 years, seen her stand up in the middle of a meeting. This is a trick, she said, and her voice, for the first time in all the years I had known her, was not gentle at all. You planned this. You wrote that clause 9 years ago knowing. I wrote that clause 9 years ago, I said, because my mother lost everything to a man who let her believe a paper existed that didn't. I hoped I would never need it. I kept it anyway, the way you keep insurance you hope to never file a claim on. I didn't plan this, Consuela. Your son did, when he let a wedding go public before a divorce was legally real. I only read the documents. Mr. Halverson, who had said nothing until this point, cleared his throat. Julian, he said carefully. Is this accurate? The petition was filed after the invitations. Julian did not answer. He was looking at me, and something in his face had finally, entirely, collapsed. Not fury, which I might have expected and could have withstood easily, but a kind of dawning, helpless recognition, the look of a man realizing that the quiet woman at the end of every dinner table, the one who read consulting invoices and insisted on clauses no one else thought would ever matter, had spent 11 years being underestimated by people who had never once bothered to actually read what she asked them to sign. I need a minute, he said quietly, to no one in particular. You can have several, I said, closing my folder. The confirmation hearing isn't until Thursday, but Consuela, I paused, looking at her directly for the first time since she'd stood up. The venue deposit was corporate money, spent without authorization. I think carefully about whether you want that detail examined any further than it already has been. I'm not vindictive, I only follow the numbers where they lead. I gathered my papers. Miss Okafor, I noticed, was watching me with an expression I could not entirely read, something between alarm and, unmistakably, respect. I did not look at Julian again on my way out. There was nothing left in that room that required my attention. The wedding, I already knew from Farah's earlier inquiries, would be quietly, urgently cancelled within 48 hours, the Cordillera estate deposit forfeited, the 200 guests informed by a terse, unsigned email that the June 14th event had been postponed indefinitely. What I felt, walking to my car in the flat afternoon light, was not the triumph I might once have imagined. It was something quieter and in its way larger, the specific, settled peace of a woman who has spent 11 years being told the letter of a thing mattered less than its spirit and had finally, definitively, been proven right about which one actually held. The confirmation hearing on Thursday took 11 minutes. I remember this specifically because Farah timed it, a small private joke between us afterward. 11 minutes to formalize what 11 years of quiet, careful documentation had already made inevitable. The judge reviewed the executed prenuptial agreement, the postal and vendor records establishing the timeline of the save-the-date mailing, the independently filed divorce petition dated 2 weeks after that mailing, and the founders' agreement cross-reference, and found the breach clause enforceable exactly as written. 51% of Reyes Meridian Holdings transferred to my name that afternoon, a controlling interest in a company I had spent a decade quietly holding together, now formally, legally, undeniably mine to steer. Julian did not contest it. I think, in the end, some part of him understood there was nothing left to contest, that a man who spends a marriage assuming the careful woman beside him will always absorb the cost of his carelessness eventually meets the year she stops absorbing it, and there is no version of that reckoning that arrives gently. The divorce itself, once actually filed and actually pursued, took 4 months to finalize, ordinary, unremarkable, almost anticlimactic after everything that preceded it. Julian kept his remaining 12% of the company. He moved, I heard through channels I no longer actively sought out, into a rental property closer to the coast, away from his mother's house for the first time in over a year. I do not know, and have stopped wondering, whether he and Priscilla Aldrete ever rescheduled their wedding. Some part of me hopes, without irony, that they did, that whatever they build together, they build honestly, on paper as well as in feeling, in a way his first marriage, in the end, was never quite permitted to be. I did not fire Consuela from her informal role at the company. I did, however, restructure the corporate events account so that any expenditure over $2,000 required 2 shareholder signatures, mine among them, a change the board approved without a single dissenting vote. Diego Ruiz thanked me privately, some weeks later, for the clarity. I always knew something was off with how that account got used, he admitted. I just never had the standing to say so out loud. That sentence stayed with me longer than almost anything else that happened that year. I never had the standing to say so out loud. I had spent 11 years being the only person in that family with the standing and the discipline to actually use it, and I had spent most of those years using it as quietly as possible, in the margins, in clauses no one else thought would matter, because I had been taught, long before I ever met Julian Reyes, that a woman who insists too loudly on the letter of things is called difficult, while a woman who insists on it patiently, in writing, years in advance, is eventually simply called right. I sold my shares in Reyes Meridian 18 months later, at a considerable profit, to an outside investment group Mr. Halverson helped me identify. I did not need the company. I had never needed the company. What I had needed for 11 years was proof that carefulness is not the same as weakness, that a woman who reads every document is not paranoid, only unwilling to be the only person in the room who eventually pays for what everyone else assumed would simply work itself out. I used part of the proceeds to open a small advisory practice, working exclusively with women, navigating divorces from family-run businesses, women who had spent years, as I had, doing the invisible architectural work of a marriage and a company simultaneously, and who had no idea, until someone finally told them, that a clause like the one on my page 41 could exist at all, could be written quietly into an agreement everyone assumed was a formality, waiting, patiently, for the one circumstance in which it would finally matter. Here are the lessons from this story. Lesson 1. Diligence is not paranoia. It is love, with its eyes open. For 9 years, everyone in Nadia's life treated her insistence on page 41 as an overcautious quirk, a lawyer's habit that had no real place in a marriage built on trust. But the people who tell you that carefulness is a betrayal of intimacy are often the same people who benefit most from your carelessness. Real love does not ask you to stop reading the documents, it does not need you to. Lesson 2. Silence, used deliberately, is not the same as silence used out of fear. Nadia's power in this story did not come from a dramatic confrontation delivered in the heat of the moment. It came from her willingness to wait, to let the wedding invitations go out, to let the deposits clear, to let the breach become undeniable before she ever said a word. There is a profound difference between staying silent because you are afraid to speak and staying silent because you understand that the right moment to speak has not yet arrived. Learning to tell those two silences apart is one of the quiet disciplines of a well-lived life. Lesson 3. A family's comfort with your accommodation is not evidence of your obligation to provide it. Consuela's phrase, "the spirit of a thing matters more than the letter of it," is the exact sentence every accommodating person eventually hears from someone who has grown accustomed to their accommodation. It sounds like wisdom. It is usually, in practice, a request that you absorb a cost someone else does not want to pay. The people who ask you to prioritize spirit over letter are rarely the ones who will be harmed if the letter is enforced. Lesson 4. Being underestimated is not a wound. It can be an inheritance, if you let it become one. Nadia was underestimated for 11 years, treated as ornamental, corrected gently at dinner tables, assumed to be too invested in peace to ever check the paperwork. That underestimation cost her a great deal. But it also meant that when she finally acted, no one in that boardroom was prepared for how completely she had already won. There is a particular, hard-won power available to people who have spent years being quietly dismissed, the power of being genuinely, completely unanticipated. It is not a power anyone would choose. But once it is yours, it is entirely, permanently yours to use. That's my story. If you've ever been the one who reads every document, who keeps the ledger, who is called difficult for insisting on the letter of things, this one was for you. Drop a comment below.